Africa is home to breathtaking landscapes, rich cultures, and immense natural wealth. Yet, despite its potential, the continent remains one of the poorest in the world. It's a story of centuries' exploitation, strategic manipulation, and a struggle for self-sufficiency. We're going to dig deep, cut through the myths, and shine a light on the hidden forces that have kept Africa's potential locked away. The story of Africa's colonization is long and complex, starting long before the famous scramble for Africa. In the early days of European exploration, Africa was called the Dark Continent. This wasn't because of its people, but because Europeans knew very little about the land and its interior. By the 15th and 16th centuries, European countries like Portugal and Spain began trading along Africa's coasts for valuable resources such as gold, ivory, and enslaved Africans. These early trades set the stage for the harsh colonization that would come centuries later. By the late 1800s, Europe was changing fast because of industrialization, which increased the need for raw materials and new markets. At the same time, European nations were racing to expand their empires. This competition led to the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, organized by Germany's Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. The conference was supposed to set rules for how Europeans would colonize and trade in Africa. However, no African leaders were invited, even though the decisions made there had a huge impact on Africa. At the Berlin Conference, European powers divided Africa among themselves, ignoring the continent's existing cultures and ethnic groups. Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Portugal, and Italy drew borders as if Africa were a pie to be cut up, paying no attention to the communities already living there. For example, Britain took over Nigeria, a place with over 250 ethnic groups, each with its language and traditions. In East Africa, the Maasai people were split between British-ruled Kenya and German-controlled Tanganyika, now Tanzania. These new, artificial borders created big problems. Communities that had lived peacefully together were now divided, while rival groups were forced to share the same territory, planting the seeds for future conflicts. Colonial governments were set up mainly to take Africa's wealth and resources. The British used indirect rule, meaning they controlled regions through local leaders, but this often made tensions worse by favoring some groups over others. The French aimed to assimilate Africans into French culture, trying to make them more French. The Belgian ruler, King Leopold II, took a particularly brutal approach in the Congo, which he ran like his own private business. Millions of Congolese people were forced into harsh labor to collect rubber and ivory, and around 10 million died under his rule. Colonization did not just drain Africa's economic resources, it also damaged its social structures. Traditional leaders were often overthrown, and European cultures and religions were imposed on African societies. Missionaries brought Western education and Christianity, which clashed with local customs and beliefs. New laws that came from Europe didn't fit with African traditions and often caused confusion. Local economies changed from growing a variety of crops to growing cash crops like coffee and cotton for European markets, which made them weak when global prices dropped. Roads and railways were built, but mainly to help Europeans move resources, not to benefit Africans. The effects of colonization are still felt today. Many African countries rich in resources face ongoing conflicts over who should control them. The arbitrary borders drawn by Europeans are a major reason for many of these problems, as groups still struggle over land and political power. Even today, African nations are working to fix systems that were broken during colonial rule. Colonization left Africa divided and weakened, and understanding this history helps explain the challenges Africa continues to face. But you'd think that since African countries gained independence a long time ago, why are they still poor? Well, independence didn't mean instant progress. By the 1950s and 60s, many African nations fought hard and won independence. However, freedom came with enormous challenges. New leaders inherited countries divided by ethnicity and tribal lines, making it difficult to unite and govern effectively. Additionally, these nations had very few people trained to run governments or economies. During the Cold War, global superpowers like the United States and the Soviet Union influenced African politics. They supported governments that aligned with their ideologies, even if these leaders were corrupt. Leaders like Mobutu Sese Seko of Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Idi Amin of Uganda were examples of rulers who exploited their countries. The West often looked the other way if it benefited them, while the people of these nations suffered from corruption, lack of development, and even violence. But Africa is incredibly rich in resources, you'd say, and you're totally right about that. Africa is incredibly wealthy in resources, from Nigeria's oil to South Africa's diamonds. But these resources haven't helped regular people much. It hasn't made Africa rich. Instead, it often led to exploitation and conflict. This phenomenon is called the resource curse. In countries like Angola, oil wealth has enriched only a few politicians and foreign companies, while millions live in poverty. In Nigeria, oil spills have destroyed farmland and fishing waters, causing environmental disasters and impacting local communities. Foreign companies often get favorable contracts that allow them to take a large share of profits from these resources, with little benefit to the local population. Leaders may use resource money for personal gain instead of developing infrastructure, schools, or hospitals. This mismanagement and inequality lead to frequent conflicts over resources, such as in Sudan and the Niger Delta. After gaining independence, many African countries borrowed heavily from Western banks and institutions like the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank to build schools, hospitals, and infrastructure. When these investments didn't yield the expected returns, they couldn't pay back the loans. During the 1980s and 90s, the IMF and World Bank imposed strict conditions on African countries to manage their debt. These conditions included cutting government spending, which often meant reducing funds for essential services like healthcare and education. As a result, ordinary people suffered. Additionally, global trade rules make it difficult for African farmers and businesses to compete. Western countries subsidize their own farmers, making African products more expensive on the global market. Many African economies rely on exporting raw materials rather than processing them, which means they earn less money compared to exporting finished goods. Corruption has been a massive challenge in many African countries. Leaders and officials sometimes steal public money or demand bribes for services that should be free. Nigeria is often cited as an example, where billions of dollars in oil revenue have disappeared into the pockets of politicians. In Equatorial Guinea, the president's son used the country's oil wealth to buy luxury cars and mansions in Europe, while most people lived in poverty. Corruption doesn't just take money away from schools and hospitals. It also makes people lose trust in the government, creating a cycle where citizens feel powerless and leaders face little accountability. International companies sometimes contribute to this corruption, bribing officials to get better deals or avoid taxes. Africa's population is growing faster than any other continent. This brings both opportunities and problems. On one hand, a young and energetic workforce could drive innovation and economic growth. But on the other hand, there aren't enough schools, jobs, or healthcare facilities to keep up. In countries like Nigeria and Ethiopia, cities are bursting at the seams, with slums growing rapidly because of urban migration. Social issues like lack of education and healthcare add to the struggle. In places like Somalia and South Sudan, ongoing conflicts make it difficult to build stable societies. Meanwhile, climate change adds another layer of difficulty. Africa is extremely vulnerable to climate change, even though it produces only a tiny fraction of global greenhouse gas emissions. Droughts are becoming more common in places like Kenya and Ethiopia, making it harder for farmers to grow food. In West Africa, desertification is pushing people off their land, leading to conflicts over resources. Floods in Mozambique and cyclones in Madagascar have destroyed homes and crops, making recovery difficult. Many Africans rely on farming, and unpredictable weather patterns mean they can't depend on traditional methods to feed their families. Climate change also leads to migration, as people move in search of better conditions, putting pressure on already crowded urban areas. Countries and organizations have provided billions of dollars in aid to Africa over the years. But aid has its problems. Sometimes it gets lost in corrupt systems, or it funds projects that don't have long-term benefits. In other cases, aid comes with strings attached, forcing African governments to adopt policies that may not be best for their people. Some experts argue that aid creates dependency, while others believe it is crucial for disaster relief and development. For instance, food aid can help during a famine, but if given for too long, it might undermine local farmers who can't sell their crops. The challenge is to make aid more effective and focused on long-term solutions. Despite these struggles, Africa is full of hope. There are tech hubs in Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa that are creating jobs and driving change. Young Africans are developing apps, starting businesses, and finding solutions to local problems. To move forward, Africa needs strong, honest leadership, fair trade opportunities, and investment in education and infrastructure. The future depends on building from the past while empowering the next generation.